The March meeting of the Washington County Quorum Court Jail Law Enforcement Courts Committee will come to order. Could I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
Move to adopt the agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed, no. The agenda is adopted. Item 3, reports. First, we'll have the juvenile detention report.
Good evening. In your packets, you'll see the regular monthly statistical report for February. We continued as per usual. We've continued our collaborations with other agencies. Today I got a collaboration request from the Springdale School District, which I thought was pretty interesting, for JDC to help identify homeless youth. So that Springdale has collaborated with a grant, and we'll identify whenever we have some kids that come in and say maybe their families or themselves are homeless, and we'll let Springdale know, and Springdale will help them with some resources for shelter and food and clothing and such. So that's kind of exciting to be able to help them with that. Spring break is getting ready to happen, so school will be out, and we'll be using community volunteers as well as some paid through a grant people that come in and do structured activities with the kids, so they're still continuing with structure. Also in your packet, you'll see the 2018 annual statistical reporting. Just gives you an idea of how many kids we held, for what reasons we held them, and the highlights for the year as well. So if anyone has any questions about that, you can peruse through here, or feel free to call me or email me, and I'll be happy to discuss that with you. Or if something pops out tonight, I'll be happy to answer that as well.
Can you state your name?
Jeannie Mack.
Thank you.
And that's all I have.
Anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any questions?
I'm good.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next will be item 4, the Sheriff's Office report. The first one is the Enforcement Activity Report.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. I will just kind of defer to questions. There's nothing new to report on enforcement. Everything's running along pretty smooth right now. Anybody has any questions about the report, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
Any questions from committee members? Any questions from the other JPs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Next will be the Detention Activity Report.
Good evening. My name's Randall Denzer. I'm the jail administrator. I hope this goes as fast as the last one did. As you can tell, our numbers are they're slowly easing up. We're getting more people. You know, we joke about business is good, but it really is. As you can see on your report. If you have any, that's all I have, unless we need to go into some detail.
Justice Harbison.
I have my normal question. How many pretrial people do we have today?
Well, it's still staying about the same. I think we was like 396.
396.
Yeah, it slow goes up a little over 400 and then comes back, but it's holding right at the 400 mark.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, sir.
Okay, and then the detention pretrial, usually have to come back twice to do this, the bed count. With the graph you see, as this is going up almost off the graph to over 700 from time, you know, different times. On this report here, we had, today we had 69 males on the floor and 3 females. So, you know, we're up to 72 folks now sleeping on the floor. So let's kind of go with this graph show. It's just, it's gaining every day. So that's all I have for that.
If there's no questions, thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Item number 5 under unfinished business is the presentation on the proposal for the jail expansion. Sheriff Helder.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're in our third month into your new terms, and we've kind of kicked around, discussed, and heard from a lot of people so far, which I hope has allowed you all to somewhat get your arms around the issue at hand, which is our current and past overcrowding situation and the closing of Springdale's jail looming in the near future, which is kind of putting us to the breaking point. So we thought tonight that this would be the opportune time to have Jim Langford, who authored that report that was given to you about potential jail expansion, a needs assessment, if you will, based on history, based on current, and based on future growth trends and his extensive experience in this industry. So without further ado, I'd like for Mr. Langford to come forward. I tell you what has been helpful, and of course you all can do it however you want to do it, Mr. Chairman, but I found in past meetings with him, when he's presenting, you guys could jot down questions that you might have and let him finish his presentation, because what we found in the past is he may generate a question early on, but he answers it in point 3 or 4, and then maybe all the questions could be answered at the conclusion of his presentation. And then after Mr. Langford finishes up, we'll have Shep Russell, the bond counsel that did the draft of the ordinances. He'll be here to explain the ordinances, to answer questions, and obviously show you what's going on in that venue. So without further ado, I just ask Mr. Langford to come and begin his presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening again. My name is Jim Langford. For whoever was on the committee previously, you're going to be seeing essentially the same presentation presented in October of last year. For the rest of you, this will be new. And again, I do believe if you let me kind of go through it, it's a series of logic statements, if you will, to allow you all, the intent is to allow you all to try to make an informed choice with the facts, and then we can pick up the questions at the end of the presentation. Just a little bit of background. I am the architect of record on the existing facility. We started planning on that project in about 2000. So I and the group I'm affiliated with have been working with county level correctional detention facilities for, gosh, at least 20 years plus, and I myself go back a lot longer than that. For ease of memory, and you see the title on what was given out, the SB South Build Team, that's nothing but a nickname for ease of memory. And so with that, I'm going to set aside who we are and get into what this is. Last year, and at the time this was produced, the sheriff asked us to look at a few things. And essentially the question was, why is the jail at the capacity that it is now? What led to what we did back in the 2000s? Why are we where we're at now? And what kind of logic sequence do we see? You should have with you, one says memorandum of record with the SB, and this is sort of an outline of the slides that I'll go through. The other is two pieces of graphic. The first is to just talk about, we're wanting to go from, if you see the bullseye, we're wanting to go from macro, the big picture, to the micro, to the details of why it's the size it is. It's just a simple graphic to emphasize that. And the second graphic I'll speak to later, the eggs, if you will. So why is the jail at the bed capacity that it is? What are the options that you have before you? Now, I'm assuming I can't see literally what you're looking at. I'm seeing is a series of loops in which, okay, we're together. In part of what we're doing is a process of loops, dipping into details to a certain degree as useful without unnecessarily getting into the weeds. And ultimately, you'll determine that, but hopefully as we go through, you'll see where there could be areas that may need a different level of focus, but for the purposes of what we're doing, looking at the jail capacity, why it is what it is now, I'll try to stay out of the weeds unnecessarily. There are a lot of factors that we could look at, you can see on your screen, that have to do with what's going on in the community, what's going on in terms of how people are processed into the jail, what happens in the facility. But again, we want to stay high enough up, if you will, to get the big picture and not get lost in the details. Not that some of these details for other reasons are not very important to look at, but for what we're doing here, hopefully you'll agree as we kind of go through this. So in a sense, we want to touch on the major things that deal with the community. We want to deal with the major things that deal with what leads to people being incarcerated at the jail. We want to deal with the major things that deal with within the jail and as people, i.e., exit the facility. There are a couple of 4 or 5 items that I want to touch on, what I'm going to call not secondary, but other key items that have a bearing behind the scenes, and I'm going to touch on those first and then come back to this slide, if you will. Okay, first, and some of this you may have heard before, due to classification issues, jails are generally considered operationally full prior to filling every bed. This is often referred to as the 80-20 or 90-10 rule. Hence, not every type bed will be filled at any given time due to male, female, felon, misdemeanor, violent, nonviolent type issues. As you might imagine, if a 50-bed jail had a capacity for, let's say, 10 men, and you only had 9 arrested, then there might be an empty bed. So just again, simple example, I think that's fairly evident common sense that you're not going to always have the exact types of inmates to fill a facility. Second, another key factor is that this is not just something that's been brought up and talked about only in the community. For the last 2 years, 2017 and 18, Washington County has been cited by the Arkansas Jail Standards. Now again, this was produced about 6 or 8 months ago, so the timing is a little different, has been cited by the Arkansas Jail Standards. The report indicates the inmate population has been outpacing the facility's capacity. The 2018 report in particular encouraged identifying an option that is long-term. Now, the point here is that there's a state review agency that's making these same kinds of comments, and they've been doing so for several years now. Washington County does house inmates for other agencies. Approximately 40 to 50, or around 5 or 6%, inmates are held for the feds and or other counties. That's occasionally asked, are you housing for other people? At any given time. In part, housing these inmates contribute approximately $3 million a year to the county coffers. So decision, you can make the decision we won't house for anybody else. That's a $3 million decision, roughly, approximately, a key other factor. At any given time, approximately 125 inmates are awaiting transfer to the Arkansas Department of Corrections. As you might imagine, people are convicted and sentenced, but there's not room at the state, and so there's a backlog, if you will. That averages somewhere in the neighborhood of about 125, or about 17%. And then the last other key factor, Springdale intends to close its city jail. Although this will have some impact on Washington County's detention housing, the most significant impact will be on intake. This will add approximately 7,500 arrestees per year to the 12,000 arrestees processed per year at the Washington County intake, more than 50% increase overnight when that happens. So again, the housing impact will be relatively nominal. The impact on the booking intake will be significant just in terms of paperwork and processing. Okay, so we come back to that slide I mentioned we'd come back to before we looked at these other key components. So again, looking at If I could get a bottle of water, that would be greatly appreciated. Again, coming back to this slide, we want to look at major factors from the community, how it leads to the jail. Again, this first graphic, sort of the macro, if you will, the bullseye. If you can see, it says community, crime, arrests, incarceration. So we're going to, thank you very much. So we're going to walk a path that takes us from the community as a whole to the point to the jail housing and the beds. And hopefully as we track through it, it'll be a very common sense perspective that you can relate to. In addition to that, as you might imagine, how inmates then are processed on the other side, in effect released, how efficient that is has an impact. I tried to think of another word, but constipation is the one that I'll use. I think it illustrates itself. That's important. If no one ever leaves, there's an issue. Okay, so first let's take a look at the community. Washington County is growing quickly. I don't think I'm saying anything to you that you don't know and you don't hear every day, but let's just point out some notations of where it's said. Northwest Arkansas Open Space Plan, it notes that in a per trust for public land. Northwest Arkansas leads the state. That's in the Talk Business and Politics in Arkansas. And again, these were representative examples I could locate 8 months ago. You can probably find others. Widespread growth in Northwest Arkansas per Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis. Among the nation's fastest growing per Northwest Arkansas County. You can go to the U.S. Census data and actually look at the statistics. I don't think I'm saying anything here in a way we don't all know. So how quickly, how significant is that? Between 2015 and 2016, Northwest Arkansas added 31 people per day, 22nd fastest growing area in the U.S., represented a large portion of population increase in Arkansas, will be a top 100 MSA by 2019. I've been designing justice facilities for almost 30 years, 20 years almost exclusively. We do these common sense assessments for many counties, some small, some larger. When you're having single digit growth that's in the, say, high single numbers, that's considerable growth. That's fast growth, that's growth of input. Even growth of a couple of 2 or 3% is reasonable growth. You all are experiencing growth 20 to 25%. It's extraordinary growth. Those statistics you may not have been aware of, but the general fact of tremendous growth, I think you've heard. This drives everything that we're going to be talking about afterwards. The magnitude of this is significant. Okay, so I'm going to look at show you a couple of graphs and try to relate back to the 2000 decision-making process and then paint a picture for you that hopefully gives you some decision-making abilities about what you might want to do in the future. Back in 2000, the planning started looking ahead of what should be done, and one of the things we did at that time was look at the population projections. On this graph, the blue line indicates what's actually happened, and the orange dash line, if you will, shows what we projected back at that time. And you'll notice that there's a gap. And around 2000, we were projecting ahead. We were looking at about what we thought was 18 to 20% growth, a growth of about to 212,000, projecting out 15 years. What's actually happened in that 15 years, which is now getting close to 20, was that your growth was to closer to 250,000, or a growth rate closer to 25%. So that's one of the things that's different, that of what actually happened versus what we were looking at around 2000. The decision was made to look out 15 years. To an extent, that's an arbitrary distance. In our planning processes, typically we look at 15 to 20 years because in most counties, if you're borrowing money to build a facility, you're wanting to look at a facility that will last the term of the note, if you will. And a lot of these are 15 to 20-year lengths. A few cases, counties will borrow money and it'll go to 30 years. And in some singularly unusual, you all are able to pay off a note back then in just a couple of years. And I think you still have that situation. But this was the normal time frame, and the decision was made to look out at 15 years, at 2015. And so the actual growth and what was projected, some 40,000 difference. And some of the comments that I'll make later will feed back to giving you a sense of what that distinction means. So a takeaway from this, without getting too lost in the details, is significant growth was projected in 2000 Washington County planning, but actual growth exceeded projections by nearly 18%. We projected about 18 to 20% of growth, and it's closer to 25%. It was significantly greater. Okay, again, just in a logic sequence, if you have a population and nobody ever commits a crime, the jail's not going to be populated. So the next step is to take a look at crime and see how it's compared. If you look in the upper right, the graph that's shown there, the redder it is in simplicity, shows the greater the crime rate. Looking at the graph down at the bottom left, this is a little more specific. You notice the two orange bars are Washington County. The other bars is the state of Arkansas, the Fayetteville, Springdale, Rogers metro area, and then the United States. The time frame that we're looking at here is over the last 20 years or so. The various graphs that I'll show you are generally covering different periods that are speaking to from around 2000 to now.
Thank you.
The takeaway from this is that the Washington County crime rate is somewhat higher than surrounding counties, i.e. the upper right, and it's also somewhat greater than state and national rates. Now the specifics here I would submit for our planning are not critical, but it's at or greater than, because I'm going to show you some data that this is going to compare to as we go forward. So it's at or greater in terms of crime. If no arrests are made for those crimes that are committed, then once again there's no population in the jail. So we take a look at arrest comparison. What you see on the right-hand side, you see a blue graphed line. Again, this is going from about 1994 to about 2013. Again, roughly the period we're talking about. You'll see that the arrests are decreasing overall, but it's following a trend, and in the end, it's slightly more than the Arkansas state rate and the national rate. So once again, the crimes is equal to or greater, and the arrests are roughly equal to or greater. Now there's some other things here at some point you might want to look into. Why in the 90s was it so much? But again, for the purposes of what we're talking about, it tracks population growth, crime growth, and arrests. Okay, again, a takeaway here would suggest Washington County arrest rate, which was much higher 30 years ago, is now only slightly higher than the state and somewhat higher than national rates, but is higher. Okay, and once again, if the people that are arrested are for whatever reason never brought to the jail, then we don't have any capacity there. So we take a look at the next component. As we arrive at the jail, if you will, the average incarceration. The graph in the upper right, and in this particular graph, shows 386 roughly per 100,000 inmate. If you will, I'm going to mentally move the decimal points over in both cases, and instead of talking about 386 per 100,000, I'm going to talk in terms of 3.86 per 1,000. It's the same math. It's just, as a planner for this kind of thing, that's the way we tend to talk about it. So if you allow me that. Washington County average incarceration rate is about 3.86 beds per 1,000 population. Comparatively, the national rate in this snapshot is about 3.26 beds per 1,000 population. So the takeaway is it's a little bit higher. In the South, that's generally so. We can get into details of why in the South versus other parts of the country, but it is so. I'm going to suggest from this that we create a parameter that we can use in looking at some statistics. So we'll use 3 beds per 1,000 population, and one of the reasons back in 2000 we defaulted to that. And then as a lower end, if you will, and then 4 beds per 1,000 population as a bookend for an upper end parameter. And if that's a little confusion, if you'll let me go forward, we're saying from the top side, round to 3.86 up to 4, and for the low side, round to 3.26 down to 3. Okay, that speaks a little bit to the county population as a whole and how it transitions into the jail facility. Now, coming back the other end, we talked about leaving. If it's not efficient in terms of how inmates are processed, then we may have something that needs to be looked at there. So we took a look at something called average length of stay. The national average length of stay, and this is a period of 99 to about 2016, is about 22 days. In the South, it's about 23 days. The Arkansas state's about 12 days. And Washington County's about 13 days. So there's a lot of things involved there, the courts, processing with the attorneys, all those things, but as an overview, is comparatively efficient in processing arrestees through the jail. So that there doesn't appear to be, again, using maybe a poor word, but an accurate one, there doesn't appear to be a great deal of constipation. There's not something that jumps out. There are cities that I can pull up that would show over 50 days. And so that would possibly see an artificial increase in jail capacity because there are people not being processed out. But here it appears that it's being processed relatively efficiently. All right, let's go back to the slide that we looked at in 18, where we said the takeaway was significant growth was projected in 2000 planning, but actual growth exceeded that. What I want to do now is expand on that. So on the right side of the slide, you see the same dashed blue, which is the actual projections of how it's grown, and then the dashed orange or brown of what we projected back in 2000. Down at the very bottom of that graph, you see a light gray line, and that shows the way the jail actually did statistically fill up once it was built. The blue line, the solid blue line, represents the 3 beds per 1,000. And the solid green line represents the 4 beds per 1,000. So here it is blown up. Again, the actual and projected growth in the dashed lines, the 4 and 3 beds per 1,000, and the gray, which is the actual populations of the jail as it was built and then filled. Again, we did this projection back in 2000. We projected forward 15 years. And if you look at where it crosses the roughly 3 beds per 1,000, you'll see that's at about the 600 or so bed range. In 2000, the Washington County Sheriff's Office and the county targeted around 600 to 700 beds based in parts on 3 beds per 1,000 in 2015. So you can see to some extent the logic that was used back then. My observation is, in doing this kind of planning, because these beds are not free, there's always a tendency to skew to the low side because of trying to be prudent with community dollars. And so looked at 15 years instead of 20 or more, used the 3 beds per 1,000, and what was built is what you have out there. And in part, this speaks to why it's full now, because it grew at a greater rate of 40,000 more people to this point than was anticipated. And so all those speak to where the population is now. That gives you some background information as we begin to look forward. Okay, let's take a look forward. We want to compare the jail capacity now to nationals looking forward. So this graph to the right has added to it in sort of the royal blue and in the orange yellow, the solid lines, that's the 4 beds and 3 beds per thousand respectively, projected forward some number of years. I'm using a starting point arbitrarily of 2020. I could have used 2018, but it didn't work well with the graphs, and maybe now it appears more prudent because the time frames that have lapsed. But I'm using a start point of 2020, and you can see where it crosses the 3 beds and 4 beds per thousand. We can use 15 years to project out to 2035, as we did previously. This is your choice. Or we could go 20 years and look out a little further. And again, you can see where there's kind of a box, a parallelogram, if you will, or a box created that's bounded by the 3 beds and 4 beds per thousand and the 15-year and 20-year point. And now I've just shaded it in yellow to identify it and highlight it. What should be the new target range? You have the information of what was thought about and used back in 2000. You have some of the ranges that you can consider here, using 15 to 20 years as a possible bed range of 1,000 beds or up to 1,500 beds. That's where the blue line crosses the 2015 time frame, or the orange line crosses the 2020, an upper-lower range that you might consider. Now, if you will, I'm going to step over and go to the second graphic here, because back in 2000, we had a blank slate. We had no facility. We didn't have anything we were looking at. But now you have an existing facility that we're talking about expanding. It has certain constraints that your law enforcement people have gotten used to working within. And so I want to go to this second graphic, if you will, and just look at it just 1 second. It's a silly graphic showing these eggs. And the illustration I'll use, if you'll let me, is if you're going to cook a large meal and you're looking at how many eggs you might buy, knowing how those eggs come, half dozen, 18, 24, those increments, knowing that might have an impact on how many eggs that you would buy, if you'd excuse the silly example. So I'm going to step aside and take a look at the existing facility just for a couple of slides, if you'll stay with me, and then we'll come back to this about what should we think about expanding to. Very simply, shape affects staffing, it affects expansion. And in particular, you have a certain kind of facility that has a certain kind of shape for a particular reason. That's important because the true cost of a detention facility is in staffing. If you look at this pie, less than 20% of the total dollars expended over a 30-year cycle, and you can look at the expenditure at the jail facility for what it was cost to be built and how much you've spent on salaries since to understand this, but generally speaking, less than 20% of the dollars you'll spend on a 30-year life cycle of a jail facility snapshot will be in bricks and mortar. The great majority of that's in staffing. Therefore, we're always wanting to take a look at how to minimize the requirements for staff, and that any staff position, what we call a full-time equivalent, the FTE here, if someone had to sit in the seat I'm in 5 days a week or 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, you'd need somewhere between 4.5 and 5 people. That takes into account vacation, sick leave, military, all those kinds of things. And then in the South, generally the salary for jailers is somewhere in the $15,000 to $27,000, and that's an approximate, and then you've got benefits on top of that. So that exceeds $150,000 a year for someone in this seat all the time, forever. Whereas the note on a typical construction is 15, 20 years. For your particular county, it's only 2 or 3 or 4 years, depending on the size of the project. And so that helps illustrate how important being sensitive to how a facility is staffed is to design and decision making. So with that, let's take a look at your facility particularly. This is an aerial of your current facility. There's a sheriff's office, there's jail support, and there's housing. The typical housing component that's there is what we call an octagon. If you will, an apple pie with a control point in the middle looking out into the pie slices. A logic pattern would be for me to be able to control the most points in this room from a single point would be a seat in the middle. The octagon sort of follows that philosophy. Now, it does not have to have an octagonal outside. It could be circular. It could be even a square. And so we're saying here the pie doesn't have to be round. And the design developed, if you will, or the eggs packaged at Washington County, the main housing is an octagon. This is what's used. And typically the octagon can range from about 250 beds in a cell configuration up to about 290 beds in a dormitory configuration. Again, don't want to get too deep here, but it has specific leanings. Again, you can buy the eggs by the half dozen, by the dozen, and so on. The other octagon at Washington County is totally unique, and it houses about 350, and in talking with law enforcement, we're not speaking to that one. It's an unusual one-off, if you will. And then there's a minimum security housing, which is about 100 beds. In looking to the future, the jail support areas, both the offices and intake, kitchen, laundry, the design concept is what I call spoke and wheel. And we can expand at the end of each of those spokes so that, in effect, the booking intake can be expanded independently, kitchen, laundry can be expanded independently, the offices can be expanded independently. And then the housing components, there are certain locations for footprints for future housing. Because of your tremendous growth, those footprints are valuable. What we're suggesting is if we're going to look at a housing location, that it be this particular one. And it has to do with how we get access for construction and getting equipment back there, and then later housing units that would span around to the left and right of this particular octagon. But again, for this particular conversation, we're looking at how do the eggs come and what kind of units and what might we look at. And then possibly a minimum security pod. And there would also be some need for expansion to the support areas, i.e. you remember the conversation about the booking intake is going to have a tremendous increase, so there's going to be some incidental to those things. So from a planning perspective, looking back at that slide, or talking back to that slide, that we said maybe 1,000 up to 1,500 beds might be arranged to look at and consider, that would suggest possibly looking at a single or double octagon, 250 or 500 beds, and adding maybe a 100-bed minimum security unit with some expansion to intake, medical, and the miscellaneous areas. Now, again, trying to avoid getting too deep, but if you'll let me just keep it the overview, thinking about these things, again, matter. You can make the best decision when you begin to have some conceptual idea of what are we talking about at cost. If there's no cost to anything, we just do everything, but there is a cost, and we want to give you some ballpark parameters for planning. You notice in the upper right the plus minus. There's a tendency when we do these things, if I say about $5, then everyone just remembers the $5, not to exceed the $5. That's why I've got the plus minus, where even though we've begun to get down into a little bit of detail, probably making your eyes gloss over a little bit, that there's still much planning to be done after you all make some fundamental decisions, but you still need some ballpark ideas of cost. So let me throw out some numbers to you that for This was essentially put together, again, last year, and construction costs are constantly changing, but this gives you an idea of relative cost, plus or minus, to make some decisions with. The Octagon, at about 250 beds, is about 31,000 square feet. We're saying for right now, for planning purposes, and we don't know when in the future you might think about this, $400 a square foot, about $12.5 million per Octagon level. And then a support expansion, said some things to the intake, there's also some residual things to medical and those others, somewhere in the $2 to $3 million range, and then a minimum security 100 beds, that's about $2 million ballpark. So then you can do some math in your own head and come to some approximations based on what you're projecting. And then there's still details to determine. If we put those octagons, if you decide to do two, side by side, then we don't need a vertical circulation. If we put them on top of each other, there will be vertical. So there are still issues to be considered based on your decision making. So now let me come back and bring you back to that slide. Say, what is the new target range? What should you be thinking about? I had suggested to the sheriff to leave it at this point, but he said, no, you should suggest something that you might feel like is appropriate. So what's the new range? Again, we identified projecting forward 2035, 2040, a low of at least 1,000 beds and a high of maybe 1,500 beds. Thinking in terms of how the units could be built, the eggs, if you will, how do they come? To consider a single or double octagon, 250 or 500 beds, and then a 100-bed intake expansion. Logical conclusion, this is from a pure planning, and at this part I'm giving a comment from Jim. It's from pure planning and given tremendous growth at midpoint of 2 octagons and of a minimum security, which would be about 600 beds, and you add that to the 700 beds you've got for a total of about 1,300 beds, which falls in a midpoint. There's a part of me that wonders if I'm giving good recommendation there, because you look back 20 years ago and it went to the high side. 1,500 beds, if it were free, would probably not be out of line whatsoever. But again, we're just looking at big picture. This also does not in any way negate looking at any way and all ways you can help modify the mental health issues, the other issues that can help mitigate the population there and improve it, that this is a reaction as much to anything, just a tremendous growth in the community. Now with that, I'm just going to leave that slide right there. I'm going to stop, and if I haven't put you all to sleep, just open it up and answer questions.
Questions? Justice Deakins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Got a few for you. You know, earlier on you were saying due to the requirements of segregation and things like that and how you have to separate prisoners out, you know, your facility can only be 80-20 full or 90-10. That's a general rule. Does Washington County fit pretty well into that?
If I recall the earlier data that Randall gave this evening, he was saying that you had 50, 60, or 70 on the floor now.
Right.
And I would say that's in part to the fact that it's at capacity. So I would say from a general perspective, I would say yes. It's going to vary day to day and week to week, but yes.
Okay. Now, if we're talking about just sheer construction, you're talking about a single stack versus a double stack octagon. If we undertake a double stack, is there any savings in that?
One of the things
versus a single.
One of the things that we've talked about since this was produced 6 or 8 months ago, in fact, I've met with Randall a couple times, and internally we've had some discussions about would it be more economical building 2 octagons that have a side butted up to each other where you're not taking 2 different footprint locations and you save the vertical circulation spine, elevators, stairs, and all that, or would it be better to stack them? Right now, we're leaning toward if we can effectively do so without taking more than 1 circulation point or 1 footprint point, that it would be better to put them side by side, and it would make it incrementally easier for them to manage, not have to, i.e., go up and down stairs or use an elevator. So at the moment, we think it might be less expensive to do them side by side if we can butt them together. But we're still looking at that.
Okay. So I was probably misunderstanding that there's no considerable savings in stacking these.
We have had a multitude of meetings with our engineers and basically on our own dime to take a look at what we think is the most economic approach. And right now, I think if you brought our construction team in here and they could pick left or right, stack or put butted side by side, they'd probably lean toward the butted side by side.
Gotcha. Now, if you can, fill us in as a court a little bit more detail, you know, from just the layman looking at this when you highlight these footprints out. It seems like your support area is quite a growth for one pod. Does that make sense? So can you just touch on that a little bit more for me? The support area you're talking about, you know, cooking meals, laundry, thing like that. When you have those shaded for new possible areas, that looks like a very big growth footprint to me.
I'm going back to a slide.
That one right there is particularly.
What we would see, and this is something in our planning process 20 years ago, and maybe this reflects some positive. In two key areas, your laundry and your kitchen, we try to provide some extra space because that's the hardest areas to easily expand. And so in terms of the existing volume, we believe there's a capacity there within that existing volume on the most part to adjust the equipment in the kitchen and laundry to handle the capacity. In our conversations, we do feel like there will need to be some added medical beds, and there will need to be an addition or an expansion to the booking intake area to handle that virtually doubled booking. So in part the answer is yes, there are some areas that we have identified will have to expand, and fortunately there was some planning that was able to be done relatively inexpensively back in 2000 that we believe can handle this additional capacity.
Gotcha. One final question. You know, I like your statistics, and there's a lot of general rules here. Is there a general rule of percentage of inmates that could be housed in the minimum security to extrapolate over the total population? Does that make sense, the question?
Historically, what we've seen is around 60-40, and I'm a little humorous about it this way. The law enforcement personnel wanted to be 60% cells and 40% dormitory, and the funding bodies want it to be the other way around because it's less expensive. What we've identified is that the current facility is about 30% cells. And so our conversation has been, the desire is to have the majority of those main octagons be in some kind of cell arrangements to get closer to what we've observed as the norm over the years, and then add that 100-bed minimum security unit then as a supplement to it, to an extent to account for Springdale and lower security at lower cost.
What is our current minimum security bed count?
It's about 60 or 70% of the facility. I don't have the number with me. I go hunt and find it because I did those calculations. But Randall, do you remember off the top of your head how many dorm beds we got versus cell beds?
I didn't understand the question.
Do you know how many dormitory beds we've got versus cell beds? I calculated that, but I didn't bring it tonight.
Yes, I think the BPO's about 260 some that's open in barracks, just had one cell in it. The other was the other way around.
And then we've got 100 beds over in the.
Yes, 100 beds for the.
So you said 269, 369.
Right around 400.
400.
It's right around 400.
And so you got about 400 plus in dormitory beds, and then a remainder in cells of some type.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Justice Madison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming again. Most of us are new, but I have listened to you twice. So Southbuild is a construction company. Your company is a construction company.
Southbuild is a teaming of an architectural firm.
Okay.
My architectural firm, that I am the architect. I wear two hats. One is designer and another is a planner. For what we're doing here, I am a planner, and the numbers are what the numbers are. The other part of our team is a construction manager, and they've not been really a part of this.
Well, and I guess to be fair to you all, if we're talking about a full-blown needs assessment for a jail, you're not going to look at alternatives to incarceration.
What we were looking at as to why it's the size that it is now, things like looking at programs with the courts to try to keep as many people out and those kinds of things we did not get into. I think those things should be looked at. Whatever construction is looked at here because of the magnitude, that should be constantly a part of the process to minimize the impact.
Well, then let me ask your input, because you all do a lot of this in many states. When you all go into a community to do sort of your construction side of the needs assessment, are there entities that you work with to sort of pair building with ankle monitors or other options? Do you have companies you could recommend?
We do not. We do know a lot of counties that do look at ankle monitors, and we can give you some of those to look at. I would say in this case, given the magnitude and the scale of the numbers, that it's something that ought to be looked at but would not make a tremendous impact on your count. But again, now you could look at me and say, well, your opinion might be colored by what you're doing. So that would take, I think, somebody else maybe looking at it, and we don't have somebody we work with.
Well, and I'm just trying to look at it from all facets. We certainly need to hear
and we would
from you all,
encourage that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Justice Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions for you. On the possible future map on page 25 of the slide, you already have it up there. It says possible future Washington County WCSO. What does the picture look like that we would be paying for with what we're being asked?
So we're talking about the very next. This slide shows all the possible footprints of the octagon.
So that's future.
We're suggesting looking at this location. Now, the key difference here, if you'll notice, there is some room on both sides of the brighter octagon, the one we're talking about, this one right here. Does my arrow show up there? You can see.
Yeah.
There is some room here and here on both sides of this.
I can't see an arrow, I'm sorry.
You can't see it? Well, let me go forward. Now, looking at that single octagon, if you can imagine where the other two octagons were, there was some distance between those two. And so what we're looking at internally is to say, since those other footprint locations, because you're such a growing community, are very valuable, they're important, and we don't want to use more than one footprint if we don't have to, but if we can gain some economies, that we would consider it, and that's a royal we. And so what we've looked at is stacking this, which would be an octagon on top of an octagon, or if you could see it split but butted together where it's still not encroaching into the other footprint locations but would be side by side. Now, we've done some internal analysis of what the most economical way to do it. There are some issues with precast and other things when you start to go the vertical distances and getting cranes in there that have some cost implications that we're thinking maybe would be offset if we could put it side by side, because precast is put on semi-trailer trucks and beyond certain lengths you got to break them in. So looking at those pieces, am I answering your question?
Yes, I wanted to basically know what we are being asked to vote on, the amount of money, or taking to the public to vote, what are they getting out of that?
One of the things that might help with this is within our process, if you all decided to move forward, to take it to the people, if you will, or for you all then to send it to the quorum court, and then that, we have what we call a work session process. We did this back in 2000. Once you approved it to go to the people. We would come in and do a week-long work session where we would identify then which of those two is more cost-effective. We would probably spend 400 to 500 man-hours here to develop that concept, and by the end of that week, we would have a pretty good budget for what we would recommend you're going to the people with. But it would take that to really get down into that. And again, it's something we did, and generally speaking, what we establish is a budget. And your way of looking at it is sort of the analogy I use is you've asked me, a year from now, we want to go buy a Ford F-150 truck. How much money should we have available to ourselves? Not what you necessarily want to spend, because we negotiate, but we want you to look at the F-150 with all the pieces we want on. Tell us how much that's the budget we put together that you go to the people with, and then in our process, any savings that come from it, you keep 100%. That's a process we used 20 years ago, so that's an added piece that we simply haven't gotten to those details yet.
Okay, and one other question, please. On page 5, or I'm sorry, page 8, the slide on page 8, it's other key factors, housing others, saying Washington County does house inmates for other agencies, approximately 40 to 55 to 6% inmates are held for the feds and our other counties at any given time. In part, housing these inmates contribute approximately $3 million a year to the county coffers. County coffers, tell me about where's that money going? County coffers, if you can't answer that question,
yeah, that may be better for somebody, where those dollars.
Is there someone here who can?
Sheriff, she's asking the dollars that come in from housing for the feds and those others, where those dollars go.
Any dollars generated through the jail go back to the jail for maintenance and operation. So we enter into contracts with the U.S. Marshals. Madison County's paying whatever dollars the state, I'm sorry, you can keep your seat. But so the state, the Fed, the U.S. Marshals, Madison County, every dollar that they pay the county back, by virtue of the ballot that was passed last time, anything that's generated through the jail, it goes back to the maintenance and operation of the jail. So basically, whereas the budget to run the jail is $15 million, let's say, then the tax, as you know, is around $10 million, so we're at a $5 million plus shortfall. That's why we enter into these contracts, so that we can help cover the expense of running the place.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other, Justice Ecke?
I'm going to defer to Justice Harbison, who is on the committee. She has a question first, and then I'll take it next. Thank you.
Okay. I used the other one a while ago. Okay. Now, you have these octagons of 250 to 290.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
assume that's the size of the cells, or whether they're going to be, what's the difference in that bed count?
If you have the octagon, as you might imagine, if you're able to, in each of the pie slices, if you will, have dormitory beds, you have less of the square footage encumbered by walls and doors and other physical objects that reduce the square footage. And jail standards calls for so many square feet per inmate. And so when you're having dorm beds that require less walls and doors, you have incrementally more square footage in the same piece of pie. And over the whole octagon, depending on how it's laid out, it can make a 30 or 40 bed difference. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Okay. Now, on the cost, about $12,500,000 for an octagon. So have we looked at, if we put two together, the number of bed, would one be a high security and then the other low security, or what?
The 12.5 is an approximation. It accounts for the overall, it's a planning number. Again, we've not done the work session, but I can tell you that there's a desire to have as many cells as possible in this new series of octagons to improve security and the ability to separate different types of inmates. As you might imagine, where you can separate and classify inmates better, it's really easier on the inmates and their psychology, and then then that turns around and makes it easier on the staff to manage and control. So I believe the desire is to go to more cells.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You were talking about kitchen and laundry space. How many square footage are you allocating for kitchen and laundry space?
I don't have those calculations with me. I could go back and do that, look at the kitchen, and I've got those numbers back in the office, but I don't have them here right now.
Where I'm coming from is I wonder how many bed spaces we could use. We already have a kitchen, and
Right.
we already have a laundry area.
And what I was saying is that the existing kitchen area and laundry area should have the capacity with some equipment change out to handle the facility that we're talking about building.
I've seen that capacity. I mean, I've seen what you built right now.
Right.
Being in food service, I would love to have that kitchen. And I feed a lot more people every day through tiny, tiny little kitchens than that kitchen. It is an excellent kitchen that y'all built. And the first time I toured it, I mentioned that to Sheriff Helder. Said the way you've maintained and operated this kitchen is amazing. Same thing with the laundry area. And that's why my mind immediately went to, I don't think we need one for that other pod. I mean, we need to use that space.
Well, that's what I'm saying, that we can use what's there and not add any more
I
kitchen.
didn't hear what's there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What I heard was you have to have adequate space for kitchen and laundry, and
Okay, let me.
to move, I didn't hear that.
Let me
that key
restate.
word.
I
Other than that,
I
I don't have any
apologize.
more questions. That's okay.
Okay.
But, you know,
I think we have the square footage there with just some equipment adjustments to handle the construction.
thank you.
Justice Duncan.
Mr. Langford, I have two questions for you, and then Sheriff, I've got a couple questions for you as well. The first is the needs assessment based on the population growth alone, or how is Springdale accounted in that number?
The Springdale's in that number insofar as, A, it's part of the overall population of the county, and B, with respect to the fact that they're closing their jail facility. It's those two ways. Other than that, we didn't get into any other specific municipal things.
Okay, so how many beds do we need if Springdale kept their jail open?
Relatively nominal. Again, in that slide, I can go back to it. What we said is that the impact on the beds are relatively nominal. What we mostly would be the minimum security dormitory, but the biggest impact would be on the booking intake, where you're adding processing additional 7,500 over the 12,000 or so they're doing now per month. So it's mostly the impacts on the booking intake.
Okay. And that's where the 1,000 to 1,500 number you mentioned, that's the bed needs, and that would include Springdale?
As a total, yes.
Okay. And then the next, you said currently there's 56% of the beds are dorm style, so non-sales. That's the math I did from 400 to 710, right?
Again.
So how many of the 250 beds in the proposed octagon, would that be dorm style, or is that all cells?
Now, as I was Commissioner, or JP Harbison, I believe what they're wanting is majority cells if they can get it.
And so that would be the 250? You could fit
Right,
cells.
closer to that.
Okay. And then I've got a couple for you, Sheriff, if you get a minute. Have we as a county done a needs assessment separate from a company that would potentially benefit from expanding the jail?
No. I mean, the assessment that's been done is basically through experience, but the reason that this company was contracted was based on the former court's desire to have a similar design, which would also tie into what future growth projections were. I think the process has been very transparent and open as far as the growth, population growth, and what the trends are. I don't.
Yeah, the population growth makes sense, but I sell cheese to Walmart and Sam's, and if they asked me how much cheese to buy, I would tell them a whole lot of cheese. So that's where I'm wondering. I think they have to do a little fact checking on their own end. So I think that would make sense for us as a county to separate from Mr. Langford's company, South Build, to do our own needs assessment.
I think the needs assessment. The applause are mainly because they don't want a jail. They want halfway houses and treatment. But anyway, the deal is the assessment would be the same, and you got to understand there'll be a separation if and when we determine, if the voters determine that they agree we need the growth, then it will be opened up. It's not that they're going to get the job. It's just that we needed somebody that was familiar with our facility, and the past study was spot on. Why would we go in a different, do you want to spend more money and get other people involved? That's fine, but it's not free.
Understood. How many beds does Springdale have? I don't necessarily expect you to know that offhand.
I think it's 16.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah. So to your earlier question about the impact, the significant impact from Springdale closing is going to be in our booking area. We are already housing and booking in all their felons. Where we're going to be inundated is with the misdemeanors that we've never seen before coming from Springdale, which is going to be the majority of those 8,000. Now, right now, just as a reminder, we've got 1.5% of our jail population right now are misdemeanors. Okay? So we're up in the high 90s. They're all felons that we can't get rid of. That's what we're saturated with. It's not misdemeanors. But I will guarantee you, when Springdale closes, and we have the ability to house, which we're going to have to do something, guys, there's going to be an expectation of the courts that have set back on, just knowing that we were overcrowded. When they issue a commitment on somebody that's a multiple-time offender, there's going to be a certain expectation that we keep them, that we don't just have a revolving door again. So some of that bed space in a new facility is going to be for misdemeanor commits. That's my prediction pertaining to Springdale.
Okay, thank you.
Tim, I got a question for you. I've not seen anything about in the dispatch centers. I know the state of Arkansas is trying to overhaul the 911 system, and I understand that they're trying to, right now we have 7 dispatch centers in Washington County, as I understand it. And the state of Arkansas is going to try to mandate you to make 1 dispatch center and put everybody that does dispatch work in Washington County's new jail. Have we got any kind of facility in there to handle that?
You may be getting different information than I am, but I do know that they're trying to shrink the number of PSAPs, which are the 911 centers that are receiving money from the cell phone business. But the last I heard was Washington County was not part of that discussion. I could be wrong. And we have
7 right now, the way I see it.
Probably too many, but I haven't heard that that's going to change in Washington County, Willie.
But I mean, when you talk dispatch centers and that many people, you put everybody that's dispatching everything in Washington County, that's going to take a big hub somewhere in there. I would assume, I would think. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sheriff, I guess this question might be better suited for you.
Okay.
He mentioned that it would be more efficient from a time management and so forth for your employees to manage a 1-level unit instead of 2-level. Is that going to improve efficiency?
It's hard to say. I know that we've kicked it back and forth as to what would be the most effective. Now, when we're talking about, even if it was double stacked, you'd still have to have floor officers on each floor as if it were 2 separate pods. I think the difference is climbing stairs to respond, elevators, things of that nature. From an efficiency standpoint, I think it's a push. I think we're going to have the same amount of people.
Well, from what we're hearing, the initial cost is going to be much smaller than the long-term maintenance and operation of the jail. So if we can build in any efficiencies there based on a single level or double level, I think it'd be very wise for us to consider that in the process. And sure like to hear your recommendations on that as far as efficiency long-term is concerned.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
I've got a question for Mr. Langford. It's a construction question. You've said the word precast several times tonight.
Yes, sir.
Where does that come from? There's very, very, very little precast construction in northwest Arkansas.
The precast that's there now and a few other projects that we've done in the interim time, there's, I believe, a precast plant in Tulsa, one in Oklahoma City, one in Springfield, Missouri. I'm not sure which is the closer one. We have found when you get to projects of this size, because of the cost of masonry and the time for construction, that considering precast is cost effective. Now don't let me misinform you. There will be block in this building, but the major components, if you will, would be precast. We think it'd be an economical direction.
The present jail, that's precast. Was it not a precast?
It's, just as I said a moment ago, it's majority, if you will, precast, but there's a lot of interstitial one-off walls. If you went in there, you'd see block.
Okay. The other thing, or just comment that I wanted to make is, I think we are at a capacity. Number one, I would not call the Springdale facility a jail. I've been up there and I walked through it. Harvey's walked through it. It's really not a jail. I mean, they bring all of their felonies down to Washington County. So I don't really see closing that's going to have that much of an impact on the jail unless judges decide they want to put more people in jail. And I'm hoping that we can come up with some alternative programs to address that issue. However, I'm going to go on at this point and support sending the sales tax to the people of Washington County to let them make the determination if they want to build two more, or we're going to have 2 more pods, whether they're stacked or butted together. Anyway, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman, if there are, I think the sheriff had wanted your bond people to talk. I'm going to turn the floor over to them.
Yes, and without objection, we're going to take a 10-minute recess, and we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Mike is going to hand out some general material about us if you're interested to be laying in front of you.
I live up here now. I don't know. That's where the money is. Nice seeing you, Brandon.
I can't get us in. You know, we got one that's one.
But see, we got to iron out
The dates.
this community. The community. Are we throwing in the communications with?
Well, that's what the guy that was asking me, the guy in the red, he's like a champion for that. So I think you need to address it and let's see where it goes. But that might be our ace in the hole that gets us pushed forward, is him saying, you know, without that, he might not push it out. So, what do you think? You know.
Sheriff Helder.
Excuse me, can I ask you a question, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
In this design phase, is there any change or addition made in the visitation area?
It'll be talked about, so far that hasn't come up, but like I said, we haven't gotten down into the details. There could be.
Okay, because the one that there's presently is totally inadequate.
Well, the other thing we do, the work session, it's open to the public.
Oh, okay, okay.
So we encourage the participation.
Okay, sounds good.
So just as a comment, what about the visitation? Out of nothing?
You go into like a 15 by 15 room, you're shoulder to shoulder with everyone.
Too small.
The equipment they bought with this jail.com, male jail company is these very cheap
This meeting is back in order. Sheriff?
Lance, I'd like to introduce Shep Russell, bond counsel that was contracted by the county to help develop a draft ordinance, 3 of them, I believe, pertaining to this issue, jail maintenance and operation, along with a radio system. And I'll hand it over to Shep Russell at this time.
Thank you. I'm with Friday, Eldridge and Clark, and glad to be with you. I've been involved in some capacity with the county's bonds since the 80s, and I was involved with the jail financing as far back as 1985. Anyway, I just wanted to explain how you would go about financing a jail expansion if you decided that's what was best for the county. And the primary mechanism of financing jails is through sales taxes. You're authorized to do property taxes. That's not ever done in Arkansas for jails. It's usually a sales tax. Anyway, you can levy sales taxes in increments of an eighth of a cent. You have to have voter approval to levy the tax. Right now, you have a 1/4 cent tax for jail operations, and one of the proposals here would be a 1/4 cent, an additional 1/4 cent for jail operation and maintenance. Now, the legislature dictates how all of this is done, so the statutes control. And so for the 1/4 cent for the operation and maintenance of the jail, it takes 2 ordinances, just a particular statute you have to levy it under. So the first statute levies the tax at a 1/4 cent for jail and law enforcement. And the second ordinance calls an election on that. Now, elections right now under current law for calendar year 2019 have to be held on the 2nd Tuesday of a month. And so, and they have to be called 60 days in advance for this calendar year, absent anything the legislature might do this time. So that should you decide that you want to do this project and you want to finance it and operate it with sales taxes, the quorum court would have to call an election at least 60 days in advance of the particular election date, again, on the 2nd Tuesday of a month. So that's ordinance number 1, 1 and 2. The third ordinance is the debt or the bond ordinance. You have to, as I said, have voter approval to issue bonds payable from a tax. And there are 3 things that are required. You have to put the maximum amount of bonds that you want per purpose. You have to put what is going to retire those bonds, and you have to describe the purpose itself. And so you have 2 choices. What is in the draft right now would be a 1/2 cent sales tax for debt. Now, 1/2 cent sales tax for debt is constitutionally, it has to go only for the debt, which means it's collected. It's usually paid to a bank that serves as a bond trustee for the bond holders, and it terminates when there's sufficient amount of funds available to pay the debt as due. The draft of the ordinance has $38 million for the jail expansion at a half cent. There's no termination date. Again, it will terminate when there's enough money to pay off the bonds. And that's the way the county did the last jail expansion with the tax such as that. There's also in the proposed ordinance a radio communication question, and that's $11 million. And the way all of this works, I don't know, in the communities you live in, Fayetteville, Springdale, and others, they have these multiple question ballots for capital improvements, and And if one of the questions passes, you're going to get a tax. And so there's going to be a ½ for debt if you did 2 questions. And if either one of those measures passes, then those bonds would be issued back by that tax, and when those bonds paid off, that tax would expire. You could always have just one question, and the ordinance would be drafted differently. But for the bonds, it's just done with one ordinance. So if you're trying to guess why there are 3, so I would be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, sir. So for a guy this is his first rodeo of public financing, this will probably be pretty elementary. So the ordinance as drafted right now, if both questions were to pass, the tax increase is 0.5%.
That's what it's going to say.
Okay.
0.5%.
So it wouldn't be 1%. They're not independent of one another.
If, for instance, let's just take Springdale, those recently had a tax initiative voting on 5 or 6 questions, and all of the questions passed, and there's just that one tax that is used to pay those bonds. Fayetteville may have that same scenario for theirs, but anyway,
So,
did I answer?
There's
okay.
no magic in those numbers, 11 million or 30. I mean, we could adjust those however we wanted to or saw fit.
That's
however we
correct.
wanted to draft the ordinance.
The tax rate and the amount of the debt, I mean, that's up to you. That's what was proposed, half, because I think, well, I don't know how half came about. Sheriff would know.
I got you.
But the larger the tax rate, the quicker it pays off. The smaller the tax rate, the longer it stays off.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay. And so did you also draft the ordinance for the 1/4 cent sales tax increase?
Yes.
So the way that ordinance is written right now, if I understand it, that's a dedicated funding stream forever.
There is no, that is correct.
Okay. And also, if I ask you something out of your purview, we'll get somebody,
Okay.
My understanding is a 1/4 cent raises projected around $10 million a year, roughly. I mean, I just want ballpark.
Kevin Fault with Stevens is here. He says it's about $9.5 million.
9.5, 10. In that range, yeah. Okay. I think that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Justice Harbison.
I'm a little bit confused because when we financed the last jail, we said we asked for a ½ cent and that we retained a 1/4% sales tax to run the jail. Those are 2 different ballot issues.
That is correct. In the scenario I'm giving you, or you're looking at, there would be 3 questions. Question number 1, for or against a 1/4 cent tax to operate and maintain the jail, let's just say, and law enforcement. Question number 2 is for bonds for a $38 million bond issue for jail improvements to be backed by a ½ cent sales tax. And then the third question would be for or against an $11 million bond issue for radio communication equipment to be backed by a ½ cent sales tax. So on the last time, the ½ cent you're talking about went off for debt, so it's gone, as was it. Then the 1/4 for operation and maintenance stayed on. And so that's the tax that's on right now for.
So we'll have 3 issues on the ballot.
If you decide on this plan.
If we approve what we're talking about right now, there would be 3 issues. It'd be the radios, the jail, and then money for maintenance of the jail after it's built.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question on the 1/4% for O&M. How is the public informed that that's a new tax and that is forever? Or are they? Can that be done in the ordinance?
Yeah, well, it can be stated that, you know, it is a it would be a new tax. As far as no term, the law requires if the tax is going to have a termination date, other than a bond, which automatically the Constitution says has to terminate. And if it doesn't have a termination date on there, it's on until the voters take it off on that, so.
And I have a question, maybe it's for you, Mr. Lester. If, I don't think these ordinances are going to be modified, I suspect. Do you do that, or does Mr. Russell do that?
I would be making the changes based on what the committee wanted, and then at that point, that's what I would do. So.
Are there any other questions? Thank you, sir. Sheriff, do you want to? Right after our meeting a month ago, I met with the sheriff and gave him a list of questions that I had come up with up to that point. He answered them and sent us all answers. Well, he sent me the answer on Friday, and I had him send it all to everybody else today. I know some people have some questions on that data. Let's keep the questions to the jail expansion issue, if we will. Justice Deakins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sheriff Hilder, I want to thank you and your team for going through all this process. You guys have been extremely responsive, and I really appreciate that. And I want you to understand the gravity that sits on our shoulders here. And the first thing I'd like to ask is, you know, we got some numbers there. The $38 million construction bond. You know, we're saying construction be from 30 to 35. I guess the extra there is just contingency or something like that, right? Or, you know, I mean, how do we get to the 38?
That's a contingency. That's what I think.
Okay.
Because we haven't had the work session to determine exactly what it is we want.
Sure.
Which you all will be involved in.
Well, yeah, and I understand that, but I guess the hard part for us is we have to ask the people for the money and then tell them how much it costs at the end. Do you know what I mean? And so that's I would like to be as much on the front end of that as we can. So I just have some general questions about the jail construction timeline, if you will.
Okay.
The data that you gave us looks like, all things considered, if we were ready to pull the trigger today, we're still 2 or 3 years out from this pod being opened up, ready to house. Is that correct?
I think ballpark, that's correct.
Okay, because in your responses here, you said 4 to 12 months just to do the design, and I'm sure this working session that you're talking about. And then from there, it's 18 to 24 just to actually construct.
That's right.
Put up walls.
That's based on our prior experience building the other jail.
Sure, sure. So the ordinance with operations and maintenance, that was the 1/4 cent increase, the tax increase forever. You know, I see that you're saying the new pod won't be fully to full capacity when it first opens, right?
Correct.
I mean, that only makes sense. It'll take a little while, right?
Right.
In your responses here, you said there's approximately $4 million in cost from the get-go, because we now have to outfit this new pod. We have to put the mattresses or beds or whatever furnishings, that kind of stuff in it, right?
Okay.
And then you said, after a while here, I want you to look at this specific language, which you said additional staff costs when fully staffed approximately $4.3 million. Now, from a timing standpoint, we're now at $8.3 million. Is that from day one, or does the 4.3 come from later on?
Later. It'll be staffed incrementally to the population of the pod.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be staggered.
So my next question is, we're asking the voters to approve a 1/4 cent, $10 million per year sales tax, but we're already projecting that we won't use that full amount we won't use any of it for 3 years, but we won't use all of it until it gets till the jail reaches full capacity. Am I making sense? I guess what I'm asking is, we're asking the taxpayers to start paying that in now, but the jail, that pod's not even open currently, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
You know there's a shortfall now, don't you, between the general fund and the operating costs of the jail?
Right.
So some of that could go toward the existing operational costs of the jail. Just not, that wouldn't be a ton of money, but I thought $1 million that's a ton of money in my world. But as far as the overall budget, that right off the bat would go to existing operational costs.
I got you.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, you wanted to limit questions to the jail expansion, but there is some stuff in here on radios, and that is in the ordinance for the sales tax increase. Okay. Where did the $11 million figure for radios come up? And I think where I'm misunderstanding this is, I thought we had a working group to decide where we're going. I thought it would be very early in the process to put a dollar figure on that. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah. Well, there was a scramble going on toward the end of last year. Basically, we were coming to the end of a bunch of people's terms. We had already educated everybody, and then in the 11th hour, really, not that it hadn't been discussed for a time, I'm talking about the radio system, but it really began to ramp up to where we have got to do something. And that number was derived from a conversation with John Luther, like days before this ordinance was drafted. I think now, since there has been time, 3.5, 4 months have passed, I think that number is low, okay, from what I understand. So I think the working group has been, it has continued, but that initial number was derived from John Luther and a couple other people.
I got you.
Okay.
Okay, so, yeah. I think that's all my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Sheriff, did you say that number was low or lower?
I think the last conversation, now I'm not in that group, okay, but the last number I heard it could be more, just because of the infrastructure. I'm telling you, it's expensive business. Jay or Rick or somebody jump up if I'm misleading folks. I don't intend to do that.
Can I tell?
The new number now, I think, to do all was last I was given was 14 million. Is that not correct?
It's 14.5
14.5.
million.
For redo all the system, but we have been assured as a committee that it will go down from there. But that was the last number that we had.
No.
Justice Harbison first.
I want to speak to the 1/4 cent sales tax that runs the jail. It generates, as I said, a quarter, about $9.5 million. For the last 6 years, we've supported the jail out of general fund to the tune over $5 million. So, the people that have been on this court for some time realize that that 1/4 cent is really important in funding law enforcement in this county, because we do fund the law enforcement part of the sheriff's department out of the general fund. But we've had this 1/4 cent sales tax that we're having to supplement. And we're hoping, if this passes, that it will be enough to run the jail, not just the new pods, but the additional money to run that jail so it doesn't have to come out of general fund. We decreased our millage by 0.5 of a mil, and we have, we replaced that 0.5 of a mil. I don't like to call that a increase in taxes, because we had lowered it. It is very important that this 1/4 cent sales tax is passed, because increasing the 0.5 of a mil, we're just back to really paying all the bills with current money. So please research this more, so that you understand why this is so important. Thank you.
I think he's right on the radio deal, that it's up to about 14.5 million. But what I want to be straight on is what that's going to cover through your eyes. Because the way I wanted it to cover is all 18 volunteer fire departments, all small towns and cities, all central EMS. And the way I understand this 11 million is going to take care of the 700 radios that the sheriff department needs. Is that correct?
I'm going to speak limited knowledge on that. As I said, I'm not on that committee, but obviously my main concern is for my deputies and our infrastructure. Overall umbrella is infrastructure for all to use. The judge and I don't recall if we have, Judge, he hit me on the head, but I don't know that we've specifically talked about furnishing radios to each rural fire.
Well, that's what the committee has been talking to everybody
well, I'm
about.
not.
And that, I mean, this has kind of jumped out of the committee's hands, it seems like. So I think there's need to be more work on the radio before we pursue. I don't think the 11 million is going to cover it if we go AWIN and go that route. Because, because if you spend 14.5 million just to take care of the sheriff's office, then therefore you're pushing a burden, not you. We all are pushing a burden on all volunteer fire departments in Washington County, which is going to need millions of dollars. We figured it up one time, $2.5 million just to give all volunteer fire departments a radio in their hands, which that'll be about half of the radios for the sheriff's office. So I think we need to do more studying and looking in the radio system.
Right. Jack, you're back there. Has this been discussed on committee?
Yes. It has been discussed on the committee as far as the giving money towards the
Sir,
fire departments and stuff.
Please come up and talk in the mic.
This is Josh McConnell, captain on the enforcement side.
Josh McConnell, I've been on the radio committee since last year. Willie's on it as well. We have discussed it in the committee side as far as allocating some money towards the rural fire departments and stuff. The 14.5 million, the new number that we just got last week, I think it was what it was for 5 new green sites, mainly down south to cover the areas that we do not have cover in right now. And that did not include anything as far as rural fire departments. It does include emergency management, all county stuff, and stuff like that. It did not, and I think it didn't include the central as well. It did not include that.
No, and it don't include the county road department and stuff like that.
It's emergency management, and it's their switchwater rescue, stuff like that in our department.
That's right. And there's a lot of small towns like West Fork and Farmington has already, bought radios and stuff and done other things. So when we go to forcing this, it's going to be hard on them. It's going to be hard on all the cities. So.
I just want to clarify my comments because it seems like as more comments come out, the water gets muddied. I understand that the jail is operated as operated at the deficit and had to been subsidized by the general fund. $5 million over the last 6 years, I'll give you that. But what I'm saying is we're asking the people to pay up $10 million per year before the jail new pod is even here. So it's not a research issue, it's a math issue.
Well, my first response is on the rural fire departments. I have 5 rural fire departments in my district. They are very, very important to their communities. This is very expensive, and we are going to really have to help them in some way, whether we do it through the sales tax or we do it in some other way. I mean, this is very, very, very important. And we have to be responsible to the rural areas just as well as we do to the urban areas. And these rural fire departments are the backbones of these communities. And, you know, they depend on that for fire safety, health, ambulance, all of that. They cover that. They are volunteers. They don't get paid. And then to come back and ask them to pay for a radio that may be, you know, I don't know how much it is. I have heard that they are up to $1,000 per person to, you know, to buy a radio, to volunteer to protect your community. And this is what this is all about. So I'm very, you know, when we do this, we have to help our rural fire departments out. Thank you.
I just want to add to what Ann says. The rural volunteer fire departments, it takes $7,800 to house each fire guy, to clothe him, to radio him. Radios are about $2,600, $2,700. Air packs, I just bought 15 or 16, spent $78,000. You can't come in here. Lincoln, I cover 4,700 households, about 99 square miles with 3 fire departments, and it's going to be about $150,000 to the Lincoln Volunteer Fire Department to buy radios at this point. J.C. Dobbs in Prairie Grove, it's around $200,000 for his. So it is very important. This is very important issue, so we need to study it a little bit more, I think.
Are there any other questions for anybody?
Mr. Chairman, may I explain the handout that I gave just briefly? Is it, you have it in front of you, I think. We committed last meeting that we would give a monthly report pertaining to the 287G detention program. That is before you. That will be posted on our website tomorrow. There's also an open letter that will be posted that's basically to you and the public, kind of describing where we're at and what my views are on jail expansion. And then the final piece of that, I'm sorry it's so voluminous, but we've been doing a lot lately in response. But the last part, the first part is question and answer. The last part is myth versus fact. And a lot of that has to do with some of the misinformation that's been put out. Some of it is accurate, some of it's not. So those are my responses based on fact that are in there, dealing with actual numbers in the detention center and how this impacts that. But I wanted you to have that in response to some letters that you have received that I haven't had time to respond to. So this is my method of doing that. And after you read it, if you have questions, please let us know. But and if I could, just in closing, just to kind of cap off my thoughts on this whole process, and I just had a discussion with Ms. Koger a minute ago. I think at times we get contentious with one another when in fact we all want the same thing. It's all about public safety, and I'm just trying to keep my message very clear to this court. I will continue to frame this issue, if you will, is that constitutionally it is my job as an elected official, specifically as sheriff, to run and maintain the Washington County Detention Center. Also, by law, the county must fund a jail, okay? And that's what we're trying to determine now. What does that cost? What does it look like? What do expansions look like? But nowhere else in county government do you find where the court must fund anything. You may fund, but you must fund the Washington County Jail. And I think I copied that in there for you. And that's just fact. Now, it's up to us to determine what that looks like, okay? I suppose alternatives to incarceration are absolutely a tool that we need to use, but I think first and foremost, we need to address our overcrowding, which is already at a crisis level. We need to address that, get this expansion done and underway, and then work with our community partners that want alternatives. And I've had meetings with Judge Comstock before, about his ideas, and I think they're great ideas. When I served with Governor Beebe on the Prison Reform Act, Act 570 came out of that. And as a response to serving on Governor Hutchison's commission, the CSU came out of that. So these are all things that I'm not just about incarceration and doing all that, but what you got to remember is a jail or a detention center is a critical part of public safety. Without it, we have no teeth in our laws. We cannot do what the public expects us to do, and that is put people in jail that need to be there. 95% plus of the people that are in the Washington County Detention Center at this moment are felons, either pretrial or convicted. Less than 2% are misdemeanors. I've gotten rid of all the misdemeanors I can, and I've been doing it for years at the rate of 200 a month. So the idea that we can save money and solve our overcrowding problem by simply releasing prisoners and do so without endangering law-abiding citizens is incredibly tempting, but in my opinion, it's an illusion and a very dangerous one. We can either lock up bad folks in jail or lock up the good folks in their homes. That's from a law enforcement perspective. Now, once we get this addressed, I am more than happy to work with these folks and others like them that want to look at alternative methods to incarceration. But you can't do one without this. I mean, that takes a lot of time and effort and involvement by a large number of people and at a pretty high expense. Trust me on that. So with that said, you've got my documents. If you have questions, I encourage you to call me, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Of course, my desire is that you move this forward to the quorum court, that we can get this issue taken care of, but I'm not a voting member of the court, so I can't do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. Justice Harbison.
I'm going to make a motion, and it may fail, but I think, you know, that we have plenty of time to study the issue. I'm going to go on and make a motion that we send this to the bond issues. The 3 examples that were given that we have ordinance on. Let's see what numbers those are. (6.1), 7.1, (8.1) to the quorum court for consideration.
Point of order, can we move 3 agenda items at once?
Well, they're all dealing with the same issue.
I was asking Chairman, thank you.
I think we can, but I think in this case we ought to do them one at a time because of the radio issue.
Okay. Well, I make a motion that we send 6.1, which is an ordinance providing the levy of a 1/4 of 1% sales and use tax within Washington County and prescribing other matters pertaining thereto. And that is for, I suppose that's for jail maintenance.
Will there be public comment before the vote's taken?
Is that, Brian, is that the 1/4 is for jail? Is that 6.1, the jail?
Folks, you have to bear with me. I can't hear and talk at the same time with our current system.
6.1 is the first of a 2-part ordinance for the maintenance and operation. So it's for the 1/4 cent. It's the quorum court's ordinance to collect that and put it towards the maintenance and operation. The second one, 7.1, is calling the election of the 1/4 cent sales tax and having the public vote on it. So yes, it is for the maintenance and operation 1/4 cent.
Okay, I make a motion that we send the 6.1, the 1/4 cent, to the quorum court for consideration.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Okay.
We have a motion. Do we have a second? Motion dies for lack of a second.
All right. I'm going to make a motion that we, 7.1, that we put sales tax for jail and law enforcement on the ballot.
We have a motion. Do we have a second? Do we have a second?
Motion fails, okay.
Motion fails for lack of a second.
All right, 8.1. This would be for, I think I'll withdraw that motion because it's just $11 million for radios, and I think it does not include the fire department, so therefore I'm going to withdraw my motion on that one. All right.
Okay, we still have 3 ordinances to deal with. Could I have a motion?
Well, we just.
Mr. Chairman, let me frame this for us just for a moment here, and I'll make a motion. So I think we've come across tonight maybe with more questions than we were here last month with, and I think there's a lot of questions that we need to ask. There's a lot of questions. I need to get really comfortable with this before I go to the people of District 5 and say we need $50 million of your money. So, I mean, and the things I want to highlight, too, that we haven't covered yet. We have a CSU that isn't even operational yet. How is that going to affect our jail population? We have a jail use fee that there's been some sort of public consensus reached on from the cities, the municipalities, that we haven't even vetted out fully yet. You know, I think to a certain degree, too, there's a sense of failure here on this. As I look at taxes in the county generally, they should grow by themselves as the population grows. The sales tax should be more because more people are buying things. The property taxes should be more because there's more development. There's more people moving here and living here. So at this point, there's some failure in this. I've also been approached several times by some people who want to introduce some other alternative sentencing methods and things like that from the public. I think it's very important that we give them consideration in this committee at the next meeting. And one thing that I've been trying to tell everyone is I want to buy. I understand the critical nature of the jail, but we need time. We need time to consider all this. We need time to understand it. I make a motion that we postpone these considerations of these ordinances until the May committee meeting. So just so we're clear, we would have next meeting to have public comments. I'd like for the chairman to consider giving them the time, and then we would reconsider these, just give us a couple of months to digest these and come back. And I believe the date of that meeting would be May 13th, but please confirm that. That's my motion.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, is there any discussion?
May 16th.
Justice Harbison, be patient with me while I try to push the right buttons.
Okay. I realize we have a lot of new people on the court, but this is not new. It's been going on for 2 years that our jail is reaching its capacity. And yes, I'm for alternative sentencing. And I've been working on this for 1.5 years, and it is not easy. It takes a lot of time, you know, and it's because it's new. There's got to be a lot of supporting, there's got to be a lot of support for alternative sentencing in the community. There've got to be services for these people that are out to help them stay out of jail, to help them be productive citizens. This is not easy. But, you know, we got 400 people, 392 people, according to, well, I started to say Jay, but anyway, every one of those people could be out on bail right now. And the bail is, I would say for 200 of those people, bail is probably somewhere between $200 and $400. Now, but if they have problems and we put them out on the street, and this is a poverty issue. we've got just as many people in the fancy condos using drugs as we do people on the street. And those people are not in jail. And I have a problem with poor people being in jail. I really do. But at the same time, I'm going to support going on and building this jail because I think it's a safety issue. It's going to take a while to educate people and for us to spend money on rehabilitation instead of jails. And it's hard. I just know we've got people sleeping on the floor at the jail. I've been to the jail. I've seen the crowding at the jail. It's real. I've also been at 8 point hearings where these poor people coming through there and most of them are charged with drug and drug paraphernalia. Sheriff Helder did a study a few years ago, and that study showed that 90% of the people in jail was connected with meth or meth use or had used meth in the last 60 days. So we've got a community problem, and it takes lots of money. I don't know where the money's going to come from. But, we have to step up. I don't like incarcerating people, but at this point, I think we need to go on and move the jail forward. And yes, I want alternative programs. But everybody wants to be safe. And I think they are in Washington County. Anyway, I can go on and on. Thank you. Bye.
We have a motion on the floor. Is there other discussion on the motion? Are you ready for the question? The question is on the adoption of a motion to postpone the ordinance 6.1, 7.1, and 8.1 to the the May meeting. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. No. Motion carries.
You still have public comment if anybody, 12 minutes.
Okay, it's time for public comment. And I've told there are several people that want to speak. We will also give people an opportunity a month from now at our next meeting. So if you'd like to speak tonight, you can speak for 3 minutes. Give us your name and address. Yes, sir.
John Comstock, and my address is 22 Ravenshoe Road, Rogers, Arkansas. I'm not a resident of Washington County. I was a circuit court judge in Benton County for a couple of years. I was appointed because Judge David Klinger had retired early, and I filled his term on the felony criminal docket. And I just want to throw a couple ideas at it, just since I know you're going to be looking at this in more depth. You were talking about education. Let me throw 2 thoughts at you that will make you maybe reconsider what you think already that you know. Because you may think that, that safety, you want people to be safe. Well, know this, national studies tell us that these people that are in jail on pretrial detention, after they're in jail for 3 days, the risk potential that they will actually create or commit a felony after their release increases substantially. Incarceration of pretrial detainees for extended periods of time makes them more risk factors to commit new felonies. We're not being safer by holding them in jail. We're creating more risk for ourselves. That's one thought I would just throw out at you. Another one is, who comes back to jail? When I was a felony judge, I asked the question, how come my courtroom is 2/3 full of people that have posted bond and 1/3 that come in shackled and shackled up? And I tried to figure out, is there a difference between these two groups of people? Why is one out free? Do these people show up in court? Routinely they do. They even show up in court when they know that day they have a plea bargain that I'm going to send them to prison because they have a plea bargain that says that's the deal. But they're still in my court on bond. Of course, the person shackled up is there because they have no choice. But guess what? National studies now tell us, who is it that comes to felony court? Does it relate to that bond, that $2,000 bond, that $5,000 bond, that $20,000 bond? It does not. That's not why somebody comes to court. It's not why you would come to court if you were charged with a felony. You know what decides that? Who you are. So when courts are trying to determine, do I set a bond or do I just release this person on an own recognizance, they need to know more information about that individual. You may know, I hope you know, that Judge Joanna Taylor is the chairman of a state committee appointed by the Supreme Court to look at this very issue of poverty. I visited with the sheriff, and Sheriff Helder and we had great conversations, and I definitely don't take away from anything he said or what the gentleman from the construction company said. I don't know that they're accurate, but I do think this. The whole premise is business as usual, that we're going to keep incarcerating people, pretrial detention. We're not going to change anything. And I would just suggest to you that there are dramatic things that you can do to change. But anyway, I want to honor the 3 minutes. I'll come back again. Thanks. Well, I don't think they'll do that. Why not? Well, because there may be somebody else who wants to talk.
I'm Gladys Tiffany. I live at 105 East Willow Street in Fayetteville. And I really want to let the court know how very impressed I am tonight at the quality, the depth of thought that your questions and your comments have brought to the discussion. It's really important that these have come out the way they have. And I thank you for that. It's really incredible. And I also just wanted to point out how much that the very thoughtful comments that J.P. Harbison brought forward really do emphasize the need for alternative methods of dealing with this. And I really think that things that happen within the county, there are many things that really we can do, and that I hope that this study that we use going forward really does include some of these, because you can tell just how very important this is becoming. This is all based on research that it is evolving as we speak. So of course we haven't been using it before, and it's going to take new infrastructure. But we need to be including that, and I feel like the court that we now have is preparing to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sarah Moore, Fayetteville, Arkansas, Washington County resident and voter. And I just wanted to say thank you for the thoughtful discussion tonight. I agree. Sheriff Helder has definitely identified what there is a problem. The jail is at capacity. But then whenever we identify a problem, and I go back to JP Duncan, thank you. When you go to present to Sam's, same thing. I used to present to Walmart. Here's the problem. What are all the alternatives and solutions that could actually drive home and create a solution for that problem? One of them is expanding and gaining more capacity at the jail. But if we build it, they will come. We will fill it. Do we want to be jailing all of our neighbors and our friends and coworkers next to us? No. What I'd like to do is actually build upon those people, rehabilitate, let them be productive in society and contribute to our economy. Pay taxes. That would be great. I don't really want them sitting in jail. I agree with you. Thank you, J.B. Harbison. I appreciate all your wisdom and all the experience that you bring. I appreciate you listening too. Some of us have gotten a wake-up call recently. I have young children. I'm very busy. I run from thing to thing. I have a baseball cap on because I've been running around with kids all day. But this is very important because this is something my kids will inherit. And so I would love to step forward. I agree. I think there needs to be a we used to call it cross-functional teams. We need to have citizens, we need to have prosecutors, we need therapists, we need folks from all walks of life in Washington County to be on some kind of forum that we can really talk and we can get to the root of how do we solve the fact that we do have overcrowding. Because I think there are some other solutions that can be on the table, and I appreciate that we're going to have some more time to talk about it later. I don't know how much time I have left, but I just want to bring one instance real quick. I've been attending all kinds of meetings trying to get informed, and there's so many experts to tap into. One of those is with the drug court. It's really impressive what they do, and so I've asked a lot of questions, and I've really been digging into what are they doing and why are they so successful. But one of the things that's really interesting is that we continue to say there's a drug problem. Well, today the drug court is full. They're at capacity. What I was told is when I talked to those folks, they said we have stacks of paper like this big in a day that we have to decide who can come. We can't take them all. They may be good candidates, we can't take them all. So I said, well, what if we could take more of them? Like, what would that look like? Well, that's additional funding, yes. We have to solve for, we need, additional manpower, social workers, and those things that can actually make sure that they're successful through the program. I don't know what those dollars look like, but I think that's part of that committee, what we should definitely look at, because let me tell you this, the statistic that I heard blew me away. If I was a buyer at Sam's Club and somebody said that the regular jail population is going to recommit at 50%, but if you send them through drug court, it's 12 to 14%, I would sign up. I don't know why we wouldn't look at that as an alternative. So that's just one thing. But giving us that extra time, Chairman Johnson, allowing us to have those conversations is going to bring up those ahas, and we can go and figure those things out together. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Peggy Chenault. I live at 2894 East Picasso Place in Fayetteville. And mine's very short. I've been paying attention to the radio system, and since I've been paying attention to what's going on with that, I've heard figures of 5 million, 6 million, 11 million, and then tonight here at 14.5 million. So my question is, where can citizens and taxpayers find the 3 bids so we can look at them and see why the cost is so high and why it keeps going up? Where is that located? It is on the
Ma'am,
website?
there's nothing been put out for bids. The system has not been quantified and put on a piece of paper, and I think that's why this court made the decision it made, or this committee made the decision it made.
Okay, so if it hasn't been out to bid, where are we getting those numbers?
We have a system where I can't talk and hear at the same time, so I have to push this button before you start talking, ma'am. So.
Okay, so if we haven't placed it out for bid, how are we getting the numbers? Like tonight's at 14.5 million. If we haven't set it out for bid, where is that number coming from?
Where that number comes from is what we presently own. We know it costs $750,000 to put a tower up. We know it costs $2,600 for radios. We know these costs because we have these costs in our hands. What they're saying is it's going to cost this much more to build new, to buy Motorola radios, to build more towers, to put the system in place. That's what it's going to cost. We as a committee has put these numbers on papers and just do a little calculation and you pop up with your numbers. That's where the numbers come from right now.
So do we have a time frame on when those bids will come in?
There will be no bids until we get it all settled.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Koger. 3661 Embry Drive, Fayetteville. I first sat in this chair back in January, and at that time I asked that you take a step back and not just approve the jail expansion without reviewing all options and studying other alternatives. I asked that you hire outside consultants, jail experts, auditors to come in and look at what we do at the jail and in the courts, not just the jail, but the jail is a big part of it. And this report that the contractor or builder, South Build, that he gave tonight, I mean, I'd like to, that's not really an objective study. I mean, they stand to make millions of dollars. So I'm saying that's not the study that I was asking that you do. I'm asking that you please do a study, and I know it costs money, but we're talking about a lot of money here for the jail. So I'd ask again that you do that and that we listen to what they have to say. I know it'll take time and I know it'll take money. And if you send this on to the citizens to vote on, like you've mentioned, how are they going to be any better informed than we are right now about alternatives and things that could be done? I mean, we can't, as a citizen, I can't go out and hire experts. We don't have the money. Even if we had the money, we don't have the power. We couldn't implement it. But this court has the power, and you can implement it, and you can take time and study alternatives. I think right now in Washington County, we're kind of at a place where we can take a step back and not just follow the old method of the jail's crowded, let's build a bigger jail. Because if we build a bigger jail, we're gonna fill it. And just think what it would mean to the community if we could do something different. If we could come up with alternatives where we didn't need a larger jail. We could be an example for others to follow, jurisdictions in the state and everywhere. It won't be easy to do. It will require a lot of cooperation between various groups of people, and it will be expensive, but it'll be a percentage of what you're talking about spending for a new jail. Let's see what else I wanted to say. Oh, and if we build a new jail, you know it's going to be filled mostly with poor people. That's how it is. And if we could have programs in place like for drug treatment, mental health treatment, education, and we had the community all working together on that, and different groups and agencies, then we could break that cycle for a lot of people who go to jail, they get out, they come back to jail. I messed my time up. Well, how much time will we have next month, Mr. Johnson?
Well, I'm going to have to talk. I'm sorry. I can't talk and hear at the same time. I'll let you know. I don't have that answer today.
But you'll let me know soon, please, so that I can arrange?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for putting things off long enough to be able to study things a little bit further. At this right now, I just have a question for Sheriff Helder. That of the 390 people who are currently in the county jail on pretrial detention, how many of them have a bond that's set that they have not been able to make and are only there because they're too poor? I guess
you'll need to address Sheriff Helder with that question.
Okay.
I think he stepped out.
Is there anybody else here that would have that?
Not right off. We'll have to research that.
Yeah. I suspect that it's probably 80 or 90% of those. If we were to have a reasonable bond set, that would free up these maybe 300 beds in the jail, and that would take care of the overcrowding. Thanks.
This will be the last comment tonight. Go ahead, ma'am.
Okay. My name is Brandy Weaver, and I live at 414 East Graham Street in Prairie Grove. I thank you for giving it more time for us to possibly look at further options. I want to know what the percentage of violent offenders versus nonviolent offenders are currently sitting in the jail, because I've seen in other towns, my hometown is Eureka Springs. I grew up there. We started issuing citations for some of the things rather than a citation to court, rather than taking them to jail. If it's something small, like they've got a joint You know, I can understand with the meth because of the dangers to it. I've seen the dangers. But there are some things that I think that are nonviolent that we could issue citations rather than putting them in jail and holding them in jail. And that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Is there any other business tonight? Could I have a motion to adjourn? Second. All in favor? Opposed? Meeting's adjourned.
I know.